Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the update with Microbix Biosystems. This is going to be a quick overview and then a lot of Q&A. So for anyone that's not familiar with the story, I would encourage you to watch some of the previous webinars on the Adelaide Capital YouTube channel. But most of the attendees here are very familiar with the story. As always, there will be Q&A, so input your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, or you can email them to me at deborah@adcap.ca. And this presentation will contain forward-looking statements. You can find those on the company's presentation on the website. The presentation has been updated for this seminar, so feel free to check that out. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cameron Groom, CEO of Microbix. He's going to give us a brief overview of the company and then take all of the questions that we can within an hour. Hi, Cameron.
Hey, Deborah. Pleasure to be on the call with you today. And
I guess you're just ending your Q3 this week.
We are, and it's a very interesting time for Microbix and very positive. And just for people that don't know our company, where I'll spend the bulk of our time today is speaking to our three sales-driven business divisions, and that being our antigen production, where we make critical test ingredients for in excess of 100 international manufacturers of immunologic tests. We'll talk about the growth of our quality assessment product category, which is a business that's been demonstrating extremely strong growth. In our newest area, which is the manufacture of viral transport medium, where we identified a critical supply chain weakness, in particular for Ontario and more broadly for Canada, and have been tasked with becoming a key supplier of secure, high-quality production for Ontario. And we'll talk about where we are in that business. And just briefly, in terms of our company, we have about bouncing around a 60-70 million market capitalization, reasonable daily trading volume, listed on Toronto and the OTCQB in the United States, and talk a little bit about our overall financial position and prospects. Just getting into it a little bit, very pleased to say that the company is now cashed up to support the next phase of growth for the company. We completed in May a bought deal finance public offering with Industrial Alliance Securities and Bloom Burton Securities, and a concurrent private placement in order to be able to accept some demand from Quebec-based and US-based investors. So we ended May 31st with over 8 million in the bank, Canadian dollars, and access to an entirely undrawn line of credit for a further $2 million. So this gives us the resources we need to support the next phase of growth for Microbix. We, of course, are on track for more or less a doubling of revenues this year over last year, but we'd like to continue on that sort of trajectory. And further to that, subsequent to the offering, we've secured a third manufacturing site here in Mississauga, which will give us access to another about 10,000 square feet of additional space. We'll use that for some admin support areas, but predominantly for housing fully automated production of our viral transport medium and our quality assessment products, and the required warehousing and logistics staging areas to support that much greater intensity of activity. So altogether, we'll have 3 buildings, 1 owned, 2 leased, totaling about 35,000 square feet of capacity. And we've got about 82 full-time and about 18 part-time employees now. So altogether, a cadre of about 100 people working for Microbix now. Very pleased, we're just finishing now in the next couple of days, our Q3, and that's gone very well. we're set to meet the informal guidance we provided with respect to the top line. I won't speak to bottom line yet. We'll see what product mix and margin shakes out at the end of the day, but we will come in the range that we previously discussed, with a new sales record in excess of $5 million in sales for the quarter. So that compares with $10.5 million in sales for the entire year last year. So you can see that we're well on track to be exiting at more than double the annualized sales that we achieved last year. And part of that, of course, there's a lot of superficial analysis, I think, that is confusing us with a one-dimensional company, but we're very widely involved across the whole infectious disease area. So our outlook for subsequent quarters is very strong. And in fact, we're already moving to 2 shifts now on our viral transport medium production going into our 4th quarter fiscal year. That's the quarter starting July 1 and ending September 30th. So things going very well for us. There's extensive connectivity for us through the diagnostics industry now, with multiple leading manufacturers of tests in discussions with us for supply of caps and development of caps, similar to the agreement we announced with the leading assay developer, SpeedDx, based out of Sydney, Australia, in April. We have a lot of similar discussions ongoing. And so we're expecting very good things. We're looking at meaningful net earnings for fiscal 2021 for the full year ended September 30, 2021. And I can say that our outlook is for a still stronger fiscal 2022. So we should be looking at material EPS for fiscal 2021, the earnings per share, and potentially doubling that earnings or better going into fiscal 2022, which, interestingly may make us a rare biotech company, somewhere trading at a price earnings potentially of less than 10 times. And we're also progressing with some of our other matters, such as Kinlytic licensing discussions. But even before that, we have 2 analysts covering the company, one independent with Industrial Alliance and one commissioned, Bruce Krugel, that are both calling for a price target of $1.80 a share in their assessment based for 2022 price target, presuming that our management team continues to execute on the trajectory that we're on. And that's, I think, a little bit reflected in what you saw in the public offering and private placement, where actually Microbix executives, management, directors bought $836,000 worth of that $6.9 million of offerings, thereby upping their net holdings in Microbix and to a material level. And we've been just continuing this build up and down the line. We're now up to 8 distribution partners globally for our caps. So there are quality assessment products or test controls that are selling into over 30 countries. And we're seeing the acceleration of that growth with sales in the first half of fiscal 2021 totaling $2.5 million, which is up a very respectable 444% year over year. And we see continued year over year growth for the coming quarters. And the overall discipline in our execution is bearing fruit. Our gross margin is now tracking in the range of 60%. That's up over 10% over last year, and up about 20% gross margin improvement over the last 2 years, reflecting both greater rigor and modernization in our antigen production and the shift to a greater proportion of sales of quality assessment products that are the branded innovative and proprietary Microbix products that we have greater value add and, in fact, pricing power over. So the strong net margins that we're seeing as a result of that in Q2, we were nearly 20% net margin. And we expect that likewise to continue to improve based on growing sales, growing margins, and a tight control of our costs. So with that, I just say we've now got over 70 SKUs in our caps. We have a number of important products we continue to sell in our antigens, and our viral transport medium sales are now going to be material in Q3, Q4, and going forward. So we're very broadly involved across the whole field of infectious diseases, not just COVID. So going forward, I believe we stand to benefit very much from the heightened biovigilance coming out of the pandemic for infectious diseases generally, as well as the greatly increased capacity of diagnostic testing that's been commissioned as a result of COVID. As COVID eases, we're going to see that capacity deployed into a myriad of other tests that Microbix already supports with quality assessment products in our VTM. So we view the future as bright in the immediate, in the present, bright in the near term, and even brighter in the longer term. So, those would be, my comments for purposes of the overall update. And I'd be delighted to begin to take questions, Deborah, beginning from you and the Adelaide team, what questions you may have received.
Sure. Well, we usually end with Kinlytic. So why don't we start with Kinlytic? Can you provide a bit of an update? I know that we've gotten a few questions about Kinlytic over the last little while.
Kinlytic is certainly quite active. We are hopeful that we will conclude an alliance that will bring back the product to the North American market as a start, and for the catheter clearance indication. It has been more challenging to do drug licensing and business development during a pandemic when everyone is locked down, and it's been still more challenging because this is a hospital-focused product predominantly. The two big markets are hospitalized patients and then patients that are outpatients, either undergoing chemotherapy or outpatient dialysis. The hospital-based products have seen sales come down. Kinlytic is not, interestingly. Genentech's TPA, the product we would be launching in competition too, has seen stable sales in 2020 over 2019, which was actually a positive surprise for us. But the partner companies with whom we would be in discussions have seen their sales drop, in some cases precipitously, as patients just avoided the hospital unless they were sick with COVID and didn't go in for regular care, didn't see their doctor, get diagnosed and referred for treatment. So that's made it more challenging, but we do believe we found partners that recognize the opportunity and want to move forward with us. So the best practice there is not to identify every interaction and discussion you have, but move from a non-binding letter of intent to a definitive agreement on which you will only announce the definitive agreement. And I am optimistic we will get to a definitive agreement and would aim to do so during this calendar year. So we're comfortable enough to say this is a project that is very much alive.
Okay, and can you give us a little bit of background on Kinlytic for those that may not be that familiar with the drug?
Sure. So Kinlytic is it's a biological drug that is in the field of clot dissolving agents, and these are different from what you would refer to as an anticoagulant, like an aspirin or a heparin or a Lovenox. These are compounds that actively dissolve a blood clot. So there are only two that have been in wide use. One has been Kinlytic urokinase, the product which we own the BLA, the master file for the drug. It used to be on the market as abokinase before it was Kinlytic. And the second agent is tissue plasminogen activator, which is a drug that sells, well north of $1 billion a year, owned by Roche Genentech. And Canlitic has existing approvals for dissolving blood clots in indwelling catheters that are used to infuse medications or nutrients or dialysis reagents. And it has an approval for dissolving blood clots in the lungs, pulmonary embolism. We're looking to bring the product back for the very specific indication of clearing of blocked catheters. And if a blood clot in a catheter can't be dissolved, then a vascular surgeon has to be brought in. The patient has to undergo an operation to return a new central venous catheter to get the necessary medications. And it's at a cost of thousands of dollars. Whereas about $150 worth of a biological can be put into the catheter, left for 90 minutes, dissolve the blood clot. The blood clot is then safely sucked out of the catheter, and the patient can continue to receive the therapies that they need. And that's about a $350 million US market in the States, as reported by IQVIA. It's probably a good deal higher than that because hospitals are not thought to be great at reporting into those services, and about the same amount proportionately in Canada. So you're looking at a $400 to $500 million annual market. And we would look to change that monopoly into a duopoly, achieve about 40% of unit sales, about 1/3 of dollar sales, and go into this market. So our project plan indicates about 30 months to filing from the point that we're funded and begin the redevelopment process to validate new manufacturing, and then about 10-month FDA review process. So you're looking from the day we would announce a deal, about 40 months to be back on the market with that product, in a market that continues to grow at about 10% a year. So we're looking at an opportunity that could readily be $250 million a year for Microbix and its partner by the time we get to market. And it's always been our objective to retain about 1/3 or better of the overall economics. And that's something that we have held to and we believe we'll achieve in any alliance that we execute. And there's a couple of slides on our presentation deck about about Kinlytic, describing a little bit about that opportunity and how we've approached it, and really refining the project scope, approaching this very professionally and de-risked from a partner point of view. So it's not just about Microbix's say-so, but that every critical step of the project has been validated with a qualified third-party vendor that's provided a firm price quotation to do the work based on our timeline and confirm that they can do the work on our timeline. So this has given us a very compelling overall opportunity, and we've certainly undertaken partnering discussions with multiple companies, and we believe we've got an optimal group selected to move forward.
Well, thank you for the background on that. Unless there's any other questions on Kinlytic, I say we move on. So I have one question about increased capacity. So will your increased capacity from the new lab space, once available, go to increased sales in response to demand you cannot meet today, or will it only impact on your cost of goods sold and go to improve margins?
I'll break the question in two. It's very much about driving our capacity, not simply reducing cost on what we're already selling. We have discussions right now with, for example, our viral transport medium, we're straining to produce, well, not straining, but we're scaling in a semi-automated production to meet demand from the province of Ontario. And it will be within our means, but challenging to meet just Ontario's demand. To think about selling more broadly, we absolutely need to automate the processes of manufacturing to move to much greater volumes. So for the semi-automated production we have now, we can do comfortably 50,000 units a week on one shift. We're now debugging the process of a second shift to move that to 100,000 units a week. But we would cap out at around 150,000 would be 2 long shifts per day, 7 days a week. And that's a very intense level of activity to sustain. So we're looking to automate that process as quickly as possible. And clearly we're not just going to automate to 1 times the semi-automated production level. We'll be automating to multiples of that. Similarly, in our quality assessment products business, we are producing on the order of 20,000 units a month of each of the liquid vial format caps. These are the refrigerator stable versions, and then the flock swab formatted caps that are room temperature stable. These are the desiccated samples. We have multiple discussions ongoing that would potentially require 10 times our current production of these on a manual basis, and that would be something that we absolutely need to be prepared for. We can move to multiples of our current production capacity, but from the point of view of continuing to improve quality management, maintaining that as you scale, degrees of automation are very helpful, if not required, in making sure we keep up with that growth in demand. Similarly, we're looking to digitize our quality management systems, which is something that's important to improve our enterprise resource planning software and capabilities. It's all about supporting the growth of revenues that we see to be very tangible, and make sure that we don't fumble the execution of not just moving from 10 million to 20 million, which we've already demonstrated we're able to do, but moving from 20 to 50 to 100 to multiples of that.
And you mentioned going from 50 vials a week to 100. Do you have a timeline for that?
ASAP. We've just, in the past couple of weeks, moved through the first double shift we've run. We've identified some weak points in equipment, specifically, not regards to people, but the intensity of use of equipment. So we're doubling up and having equipment that we can rotate in. If a part breaks on a gadget or a gear, we need to have backups that we can swap in immediately and not have downtime associated with that. So I have equipment requisitions on my desk for additional pieces of equipment, and also we're going to be putting the money to work we raised on a full front to back automation line for VTM, and likely doing very much the same both for our swab based caps and our vial based caps as well.
And what do you think the total addressable market is for VTM, and how much of that do you think you can capture?
What we've been advised from, I'll speak to Ontario procurement with authority, and I can speak a little more speculatively beyond that. But there was a mad scramble for these materials globally, and much of the material procured was of very suspect provenance and quality. Consequently, we're advised that, for example, in the case of Ontario, there's a move to distill that down to 3 or 4 suppliers, ideally a couple of domestic suppliers and a couple of international suppliers, just that they're relationships are maintained. And if I were Ontario Procurement, I wouldn't necessarily want Microbix to be my only supplier either. So what we anticipate is perhaps between a quarter and a third of the demand, and Microbix, to our knowledge, remains the only qualified vendor, domestic vendor that has a quality system that can supply reasonable quantities of viral transport medium to the province. So I would be targeting and budgeting for a quarter to a third of the demand for testing. And obviously, that's gone down over the summer. We see that with every respiratory pathogen. When you're in bright sunshine and people are outside, viruses last, minutes. When you're in November and you're cramped on a bus, they can last for days. So, we will see this, but we are seeing procurement being decided now through the fall season and into the winter season. We'll see that similarly with our CAPS products as well. But all indications are that we are getting vaccinations done. That's great. But coronavirus is going to continue to be with us in our estimation, just as influenza and other respiratory viruses have continued. Hopefully we won't see the level of disruptions, but certainly we're going to see a very high level of testing going into the fall. I don't think that employers or schools are going to go, oh, that's fine, you've got a bad cough, we don't care anymore. People are still going to get tested.
We have a number of questions about that point. So with obviously reduced COVID testing in North America, although I'm not sure we're seeing reduced testing, I think one of the concerns is that there won't be demand there beyond the existing order. While that may not be true, what other markets does it appear imminent that your product might enter to offset any decreases in Ontario?
Well, one of the things is that viral transport medium is used for any number of tests. It's not just for COVID. If you want to get testing done for any number of viruses or infections, or even for other molecular tests such as liquid biopsy, et cetera, you need something to stabilize those samples. And we're very much looking at the vastly expanded capacity for molecular PCR testing being redeployed for these other uses of molecular tests. And keeping in mind, these are tests that cost, tens of dollars for the most part. This is not, this $1 million a year therapy, orphan diseases. This is all about rubber meets the road, great value for dollars in the healthcare system. The very first thing, to addressing a health problem is, what is the problem? The diagnosis of it is where it all starts. And we see there being a lot more sophisticated tests rolled out over the next few years that will benefit all of us and require Microbix products. For example, it was fine last year to have a COVID test, and people looking at just tests for COVID were having success. This coming year, companies that are going to continue to be successful are going to have multiplex tests that can distinguish between flu A and flu B and RSV and COVID and possibly even other viruses. And that's the kind of evolution that's going on, which will still require VTM and will still require Microbix controls as well.
Well, anecdotally, I have a friend in Germany, and every day they have to get a COVID test if they want to go to restaurants, bars, stores to enter into establishments. You have to show a 24-hour valid negative COVID test. So essentially, people every day wake up and go get tested.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend working in the movie industry, and they say everyone on set is tested once or more times per week. Similarly, we've accepted to participate in the Ontario Enterprise screening tests using the COVID antigen tests in our workplace. And Microbix controls, we have very successful controls for antigen tests as well. So all of this is not going away. And I think it is a fallacy to believe that because it's calmed down a little bit in the summertime that it's going to disappear.
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple other slightly different questions along the same vein. So with confirmed cases of COVID-19 down 94% in Canada off peak levels just 2 months ago, is there an excess of inventory in the system for VTM? Could Microbix's anticipated sales be canceled? What is the baseline demand for MBX outside of COVID? I think they mean VTM outside of COVID.
I will say we've been asked to deliver everything we can deliver as fast as we can deliver it. So I'm not privy to knowledge of what inventory is carried within the procurement system, but I will say that we have not been asked to slow anything down. Quite to the contrary, we've been asked to speed it up.
Is there a shelf life for VTM, and do you anticipate selling outside of Canada in the near term?
Shelf life of VTM, we currently have a validation out to 9 months of shelf life on the product. When you're building these highly regulated products, your initial launch has modeled shelf life, but you can only sell to what shelf life you have validated to in real time. So we continue to have retention samples that have dating that extends as we collect that additional data. Currently, our product is validated to 9 months stability. We anticipate that that will likely extend to 12 months at a minimum. And then it's a question of, what makes sense to go beyond that level. So that is what we're looking at currently. And what was the second part of the question again, Deborah?
Shelf life.
Well, shelf life we addressed, and there was another nuance in there.
Sorry, my apologies. Do you anticipate selling VTM to countries outside of Canada?
To countries outside of Canada. Across Canada, VTM is a Class 1 medical device, and it is therefore able to be sold under our medical devices establishment license and our from Health Canada and our ISO 1345 and 9001 quality systems. So that those collectively enable us to sell the product across Canada. My understanding is for the US, we would have to file what's called a 510K application with the United States FDA. We could certainly do so. We may do so, but it has not yet been put as a project within Microbix. It's not been of immediate urgency given that we're selling everything we can produce at the present time.
Okay, and just a question about the Ontario government. So they have first option for buying VTM due to the grant. We know they have waived this for previous sales. What about the future? Do you have any indication if they're not going to take up their ROFR?
We have no indication at the present time that they will not be continuing to buy product. We've had discussions about orders. The initial order, you'll recall, was for $4.25 million to be delivered across May, June, July, and August. We are having discussions about orders post the August timeframe. Those have not yet concluded with purchase orders, and we would announce such purchase orders as we receive them. We'll probably do that at least one more time to give the market comfort that this was not a one-time deal, and we're very comfortable that it is not. And then beyond that, I don't know that we'll continue the practice of announcing every single order, but I think as some people have expressed concern about that, we'll certainly make announcement of the next order.
Okay. And then a couple more VTM questions. I know you already addressed the production increase, but I have another question about what's the current dollar capacity for VTM per month, and what's the timeline for increased VTM production?
Well, the capacity is infinite if people will pay infinite dollars for the VTM, but if we're in the $4 to $6 price range, you're looking in the let's call it $2 to $3 million a month broad range of revenue potential for us. So VTM was not a. It's interesting context. You know, if we look back a couple of years, or look back pre-pandemic, we had a antigen business of around $12 million per year, $1 million a month, and a very modest quality assessment products business of a little over $1 million. So 2019 sales, for example, were $13.5 million, reflective of that sort of mix. Our antigen sales have taken a hit. Those have gone because of COVID. Testing for everything non-respiratory has gone down as a result of the pandemic, with people staying away from the doctor and the hospital. So our antigen sales have been closer to a 10 million run rate, but at very much improved margins due to the work we've done with our bioreactors and process optimization and modernization. Our quality assessment product sales, we have moved from a little over $1 million to closer to $5 million will be the exit rate for this calendar year. And VTM, which was not even a thing, we have moved up to sales on the order of $5 million as well. So we'll be likely on either side of 20 million in revenues for the full fiscal year, September 30, 2021, up from 10.5 million last year, where antigen top line was getting hit by COVID, but our quality assessment products hadn't really gotten rolling to the same extent, and VTM wasn't a thing. So that's where we are, and we've moved margins up, as I mentioned in the preamble as well, and held the line on costs. So we've got a very healthy business now with a strong balance sheet, great sales growth, good margins, improving margins, and disciplined cost control as well.
Okay, well, since you mentioned caps, let's switch off VTM for a little bit. Volume of caps of 20,000 currently. For what time period is that? A month, a week? Can you give some clarity?
That's about a month for each of the format types. In fiscal 2020, we're just starting to sell the swab-based controls, and we sold about 10,000 units just in the very last week, sampling out in Q3 and starting to get a trickle of reorders late in Q4. That's now running at over 24 times last year's rate in terms of the swab-based controls, and in excess of double last year's rate in terms of the liquid format controls. So, overall, that's about a 4 to 5 fold growth year over year in that product category. And, we have very definitive plans for multiple new product introductions in that category, and getting more fully regulated or IVD class products that we can sell to the clinical labs, to the diagnostic original equipment manufacturers, and to the proficiency agencies that do the accreditation of the labs.
And then staying on with caps, can you talk about some of the new products that you've designed recently or that you're working on, and where you think the growth areas for that side of the business is?
Yes. We see some great opportunities in caps. There are three immediate term area. Wow, there's a lot of immediate term opportunity in caps, but let's parse it into a few segments. One area we see tremendous growth in is multiplexed controls. These are controls that contain the proxies for one or more than one disease condition. We'd already developed in the past controls for example, that would distinguish between influenza A and would contain both influenza A and influenza B, flu A and flu B on a swab, but we're seeing demand for multiple analytes on the same swab or in the same liquid sample. We've also successfully developed not just controls for the original Wuhan strain of COVID, but we've also developed controls for variants of concern of COVID. So we have the Brazilian, South African, and UK strain controls, and we'll certainly do controls for the Delta strain and so forth. But keeping up with this is something that we're looking at doing judiciously. We don't want to be constantly chasing cars, but rather doing it when necessary. Antimicrobial resistance in the bacterial diseases is also something that isn't going away. Everyone would have read, quite some articles expressing concern about antibiotic-resistant bacteria in hospitals and the community pre-COVID. That hasn't gone away. That's absolutely coming. There's a whole number of microbes that are evolving greater resistance to antibiotics, and being able to test not just what the infection is, but to immediately know whether the antibiotic, the standard antibiotic regimen is working or will work, or whether a deeper cut needs to be made. So we're working with companies like SpeedDX in Australia on controls for emerging assays that test not just to diagnose what bug, but when antibiotics will work to cure that bug, cure the infection with that bug, and we'll be launching products in that area as well. And then their third category we're doing some work in is in serology testing to provide controls in that area, and we'll certainly have some, I think, when we have data on some of those, we'll make disclosures around that field as well. So there's a lot of opportunities, high value, high volume, that we're working with leading edge partners on. And, if there's one thing that COVID's really benefited Microbix of, it's taken from us probably as much as it's given in terms of our sales. We were already on a very strong trajectory pre-COVID, but we had to adapt our product mix in the near term to reflect the natural focus on dealing with pandemic-related matters. But what it really has done is raise our profile dramatically in the industry, that people have seen the skills that we developed in the antigen business being deployed into creating leading edge test controls, and being able to take the expertise in formulating media, for example, to be able to make VTM, and the expertise in scale manufacturing and quality systems. It's really been pulling all these together to benefit shareholders.
So you mentioned serological testing. Do you mean rapid testing? Sorry, I'm not a microbiologist.
No worries. Well, there are three broad classes of tests. There are the molecular tests, which look for the genetic signatures of the bugs. That's the PCR testing. There's the antigen testing that are looking for fragments of the bug, of the bug's proteins rather than its genetic material. And we have controls for antigen tests as well. And the third category is looking for your antibody levels. And that becomes relevant more relevant as vaccines are rolling out. So, for example, this is a rapid test from a Canadian company that we've worked with closely that looks for your antibody levels for spike protein. So IgM and IgG, this is actually a test I took on Friday that indicates I have a protective level of antibodies to COVID after one dose of Pfizer vaccine. Now, the medical relevance of this knowledge is still being tested. It hasn't been a great immediate need for controls for these tests, but we see this as emerging as the knowledge of the roles of humoral or antibody-mediated immunity versus cellular-mediated immunity starts to get defined, and we perhaps move into annual booster shots for COVID. This sort of knowledge becomes more relevant, and will be right in the middle of that
Okay. So in terms of the rapid tests, I did have a question, which is what I was trying to lead in. So any comment on the state and prospects for self-administered rapid tests? And is Microbix active in any way in that market? I know you have answered that question.
Self-administered testing is always a hot button issue. The health regulators have, different regulators have vastly different opinions on the appropriateness and the risks and benefits of, giving somebody a test and saying, go home and do it yourself. And, that's a third rail that we're not going to get involved in what the appropriateness of that is. For us, we want to work with as many test manufacturers and as we can to make sure their tests work the best possible way and give the most accurate results with the benefit of controls. And that's the beauty of our controls business. It doesn't matter which diagnostic company gets the most market share. If they're all or the majority of them are working with Microbix on the provision of controls. And similarly, we want to make sure that clinical labs are regularly bookending test runs with positive and negative controls at the start of the day and the end of the day, so that if there's been any procedural error, equipment failure, reagent misuse or spoilage, that errors are promptly caught, and then we still benefit from those. And so working across multiple types of tests, across multiple pathogens, multiple geographies, multiple manufacturers, multiple lab companies, you can start to see how this benefits Microbix and Microbix shareholders, because we're working very broadly across the industry.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, I do have a few more questions on VTM, but I think that we've given a pretty good update. There's just one more follow-up question that you didn't clarify, the timeline for increased VTM production.
We're already increasing VTM production. We have planned for this. We're now testing the efficiency. How do we maximize the efficiency of a second shift? So that's already ongoing. That'll certainly be, any teething associated with that will be completed this month, and I would expect we'll be running 2 shifts through, August, September, and going forward.
And then I had a question just about how long ago you were asked to increase your VTM activity. I guess he's getting at, have you seen any indication that the government wants you to slow down on that, or are they still really needing the VTM supply?
We have seen no indication that they want us to slow down.
Okay, and then given the population has missed 1 year of immunity from flu, there's a risk of a strong flu season as we reopen. Given the symptom overlap between COVID and flu, how would this likely impact sales? I guess you answered it a little bit with the multiple testing potential.
Yeah.
Maybe you can.
Well, with the emergence of multiple variants of COVID, individual tests. If you think about the genetic sequence of a virus, you have a long genetic sequence, and the tests test a relatively small portion of that sequence, one or more smaller portions of that whole genetic code. The test doesn't look at the entire genome of the virus every time it tests. So you don't know immediately what portion of the virus. An emerging strain will mutate different portions, and that can degrade the accuracy of the test. So there'll be 2 ways that that's controlled. One is by regularly updating the tests to make sure that a test, for example, for the Wuhan strain is equally valid against a Delta strain. So there's that checking that needs to be done. We'll certainly make controls available to help with that. The other thing is to say, well, if it doesn't look like it's COVID, then what the devil is it? And this is where the multiplexed tests start to come in, tests that will say, not just yes or no on COVID, but we'll say yes or no on influenza A, yes or no on influenza B, yes or no on respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. So being able to say, well, you do have a respiratory malady, you are sick, and we can say with authority that it's not COVID because we now know it's influenza A, positive and negative for COVID. And this is where the more sophisticated tests are going to find a role for addressing that very issue. And we're right in the thick of that as well.
Okay. And then Q3, you said mid-August. Are you providing any formalized guidance?
We've only provided guidance, informal guidance with respect to the top line. I've said that I've been hopeful this year that Q1 I indicated would start with a 3. It did. Q2 I indicated it would start with a 4. I'm talking in terms of millions of dollars. It did. Q5 we're finishing up if what we expect to ship in the next couple of days does. Q3 will be in line with that as well, starting with a 5, and then Q4 certainly we like to see it start with a 6 or better, depending on what unfolds. But adding those together, we did 7.5 million in top line in the first half of the year. We'll do certainly better than that in the second half of the year, and which side of the 20 million mark in terms of top line we fall on will really depend on how Q4 unfolds for us.
Plus, you're starting to get some tailwinds from the antigen business coming back.
Starting to, yes, and we're starting to see some demand reemerge that appointments that were getting missed are starting to get made again, and people are having tests for prenatal care and so forth that maybe people were too scared to go and have done prior to COVID. So it's some of those, like prenatal care, you hope the baby was born healthy, but the baby got born. So you'll resume, but there's no backlog to catch up on some other diseases like HPV and other sexually transmitted infections. There will be a catch up as well, and we may benefit from some of that.
Got it. And sorry, Cameron, going back to the multiplex testing kits. So will they include the 5 COVID variants and 3 flus for a total of, say, 8, leading to a bigger dollar value per patient tested? If so, would it be like a 2 times increase per patient value versus last year? Do you have any sense of this?
I believe, I have to defer to some of our subject matter experts on this, but I believe the U.S. is now reimbursing for up to 5 different organisms in one test, but we're seeing the capacity start to expand. There are a number of companies that have 4-channel tests available that are getting reimbursement. I believe there are some building as many as 10 or more. But the whole sophistication is just moving forward in leaps and bounds. And anything I told you that I thought I knew this week may change next week or the week following. It's that dynamic.
You sound like a politician.
Well, yeah, if I could give a yes or no answer, God knows I would.
No, I just mean whatever's true this week won't be next.
Well, not in the same way, though.
Yeah, I'm just teasing. So one other question on VTM, and I know you covered other uses. I think there's still some confusion about exactly what is VTM, what's it used for. You indicate swabs. Are the uses beyond swabs? Can be used for blood, urine samples. Like, what's the real market for VTM?
Well, most of the instance here is if, for example, we've designed these principally for a sample that would be a swab, and that could be nasal swab, throat swab, genital swab, any of those that would be snapped off and fit in the tube that we've designed. So the design of tube we procured, I should say. We didn't design the tube, but we did select an optimal design. the purpose of the VTM is to stabilize the sample so that the viral genetic material, be it RNA in the case of COVID or DNA in the case of some other viruses or organisms, doesn't degrade before it gets to the lab. There are materials in your secretions, your nasal secretions or throat secretions, and just the beating up of molecules by heat that can destroy RNA or DNA relatively quickly in a sample. And the purpose of the VTM is to preserve that sample so that if it's taken in a clinic and then it goes in a van to a central lab and then it's tested and the next day, that it's retained the stability so that it's still detectable in there. And without VTM, you'd be all over the map. You wouldn't, some samples would be destroyed, other ones would be fine. You wouldn't know where you stood. So with VTM, you can have that much more consistent sample quality that isn't degraded by the time it's tested. And that's the critical purpose of it. And the VTM we've designed actually stabilizes the virus. It doesn't inactivate the virus. And that's at the request of public health because they want the ability to culture that virus to study it further if they need to.
Okay. Well, I have a question. I know you've talked in the past about upgrading your facilities from a level 2 to a level 3. Is this something you're still looking at?
Very, very much so. It's part of the stated use of proceeds for the offering. So within the core of our own facility, we plan to upgrade a section of that to BSL3 to containment level 3 that will permit safe handling of organisms that have a higher biosafety classification. And that would be things like chikungunya virus, that would be things like COVID that could be handled safely within that level 3 core. It would not involve level 4 viruses that are things like Ebola and so forth that are only handled in the National Molecular Laboratory in Winnipeg. So we'd be handling viruses of a higher risk class, but keep in mind we've been doing this for 30 years, so we've got very well-trained staff and well-described protocols.
Okay, great. And then just one last question. It's a little bit different than the other ones. And I actually would like an update on supply chain issues because that's been something that we've talked about in the past and how you've overcome them. But this specific question is regarding revenue recognition and cost of goods sold. Can you give clarity on the supply chain process regarding fulfillment of orders? Does Microbix pay the shipping cost? Does the distributor?
Most of our shipments are either Ex Works or FCA under Incoterms. So essentially, when it leaves our dock, with the paperwork completed into the vendor's carrier or the purchaser's carrier, title has passed at that point. So we don't have issues associated with damage of in-transit shipments, for example. And we certainly support customers to do everything in our power to make sure everything arrives to them intact and safely, but title is already transferred. So that's when we recognize revenues, when we have received a legitimate purchase order from the customer, and they have taken delivery of the product on those terms. And it's a big subject of audit, as I presume the questioner knows, is to make sure that companies have appropriate revenue recognition policies. And it's never been flagged with us as any issue with any of our audits. And we're quite diligent about it.
And how are you finding supply chains right now? I know this is a big global issue.
it's a big issue. We were on it very early, and you've seen an increase in the raw materials component of our inventories as we report our quarters, and that's really because we've created some buffering of raw materials to make sure we haven't had any supply chain interruptions. We have had challenges, and you'll remember Q3 of 2020, we had faulty materials provided by a vendor that cost us about $500,000 and lost production due to, in that case, bad media bags that had pinholes and cracks in them that were microscopic and resulted in contaminations before we flagged exactly what the issue was. That's the biggest supply chain issue we've had. We have had challenges procuring materials and had to validate second or third suppliers, but thus far we've not lost sales because we couldn't make product, thank God. And that's, I'd like to think it's good execution and good planning more than good luck, but, I think it's been a challenge for a lot of companies.
Okay, we're just at the hour, so I don't know if you have a prior engagement or if you can go over for a few minutes, Cameron.
I can certainly go over for a few minutes if we've still got an audience.
I think we've had a little bit of drop off, but still going strong at around 50. So let's make 50 people happy, Cameron.
Okay, sounds good.
So I have two questions left. And I mean, these are probably the two questions that we get the most right now, which is going back to, again, VTM and uncertainty about the future beyond COVID. And this is about guaranteed sales contract for VTM to provide visibility of market security. I guess the question is, let's say the Ontario government says no, they don't want any VTM. Like this investment that you've made and the future for VTM, would you still be comfortable with that? If COVID completely disappears, do you still think there's a market for VTM?
Very much, and I think this is where the pandemic has really exposed some horrible weaknesses in our approach to public security, which is that if one of these things breaks open, you're on your own. And what we've endeavored to do with VTM is procure absolutely everything we can procure from secure Canadian supply chains, create a very high quality product at a very competitive price. So, this comes down to how we hold our government to account. If, for example, if procurement is completely divorced from public policy and just says, well, you know what, I get paid to get the cheapest product, and I have no accountability for the quality of that product or what happens, in a future pandemic, in COVID-23 or flu 25. Sure, you can probably get product somewhere of suspect provenance and quality a little cheaper than we can make it here, but not a lot cheaper. And it's not going to be there when you need it, and you're always going to be looking over your shoulder on the quality versus you can come in and audit the hell out of us with catching a bus. You're going to have a lot harder time doing that if you're getting it from a regime somewhere on the other side of the world. So I can't offer that guilt-plated assurance, but I can tell you that the people with whom we've interacted understand that there's a need for domestic security of supply, and for that matter, domestic, economic prosperity. And that's a bit of what we're bringing to. We've added to our good jobs that are continuing to hire more people and bring more economic activity. And I can tell you, we do pay. Certainly I'm paying a good amount of tax, and most of our other employees are as well.
And I'll point out something that you've mentioned in the past. I think Bruce put in his report, which is that VTM and swab imports into Canada in 2019 pre-COVID were like 56 million US. So if anyone thinks there's not a market for this beyond COVID, there was certainly a market before, and I can only imagine that infectious disease testing for the rest of our lives is going to be at an increased level. Tell me.
Yeah, I would not want to be, a political leader standing up in the legislature explaining why I'm cutting reimbursement for infectious disease testing, post COVID. I don't think that's a big seller.
Agreed. Okay, so then one other question came in, which I think is relevant. So if VTM volume does drop off, could the VTM production line be shifted to other Microbix products? And what would be the CapEx and time required to pivot?
Yes, that's something we've, of course, asked ourselves. And we've said, if we're laying in an automated VTM production line for example, for this size of vial, how quickly could that be retasked, retooled for the smaller vials of caps? And yes, it is doable. So we'll be spending a good amount of money on VTM with a fast recovery, but in a situation that, for whatever bizarre reason, there was no demand for VTM, a very good portion of that could be retasked and redirected into our quality assessment products. I would bracket, the extreme levels, the low extreme level negativity for VTM is likely still materially higher than what we will have sold in VTM in 2021. So that's a business to me that is very material, likely at least as material in dollar terms as our antigen business. And then our test controls will likely eclipse both of
those. Okay. And then the last question is really just on share price, and we've talked about this a lot. So is the recent weakness mainly due to financing or combination of this and COVID testing concerns? Is it a lack of understanding of the company? I think from my perspective, it's an overall market thing. Like you've seen a lot of the small caps trade down, liquidity is drying up, maybe profit taking on recent positions or recent moves. I don't know, Cameron, what's your sense?
I think it's a bit of a combination. There's certainly some, likely some faster money investors allotted shares in the offering that said, "Oh, great, I can get out even," and keep the half warrant that was associated with the deal. But that's short-sighted, and we'll, if we haven't already burned through that, we will. Then I think you've got a bit of this, conflation of Microbix. There are companies that are working on a test for COVID that have not sold a single dollar of a test for COVID, or maybe are testing just for COVID, that are trading at higher market capitalizations than Microbix. So we're looking at a multifaceted business with sales, with earnings, that is pretty uniquely positioned to benefit from the new post-pandemic normal, and we're maybe bucketed with companies that are in it much more recently and much more one-dimensionally. And I think that's a position that people will regret if that's the investment thesis. I don't think it's correct. So we may be well looking at ourselves, at a forward price earnings multiple of less than 10, when peers may be trading at 20 to 40 times, depending on what your price earnings to growth algorithm is. But we are not as appreciated as we probably should be, in my opinion. And that's why you've seen me on the, I bought shares since the offering, and I don't know if anybody's flagged it up, but I just saw a SEDI report from our chairman, buying additional shares. So, we're putting our money where our mouth is and continue to.
Well, you made the mistake of creating a real company, Cameron. A hope and a dream always does better in the markets initially. I think, You have visibility on 2 additional record quarters. Anyone that's selling here, I can't understand the logic. I can understand the logic into what you think is a peak quarter, selling into that, but I can't understand selling into Q3, which is going to be record. You have good visibility on Q4. And by the time we get through Q3, you'll probably have good visibility on Q1. It doesn't make any sense to me why anyone would be selling right now, but I guess that's what makes a market.
That's what makes a market, and the opportunities. And what we are doing is creating, as you said, creating genuine business value. And you're quoting an investment banker who will go unnamed that said, to me, Cameron, this would be much easier if you didn't insist on creating a real company. Not that I created it, but our team is working to build it and build real value, and that's a more nuanced discussion than just chasing the big shiny thing.
Yeah. And I think that we have been brought down. Like if you look at a lot of the COVID names, they've been crushed over the last little while. Like I think we have outperformed that group. But yeah, certainly that has, I think, affected the share price in the short term, but I think it's misguided. One of the things that I highlighted in that note that I wrote, which I think is really important, is number one, the company's got the most cash that it's ever had, at least since I've known it. You've shown the ability to pivot, create new products, and really perform extremely well in adverse conditions. So I guess I just don't see how that wouldn't be the same in a more normal environment.
Well, and part of it too, Deborah, is we make a habit of talking about things once we've done them. We don't talk about the things that we're working on and that are as yet incomplete. And part of that is strategic. We don't necessarily want to lay a breadcrumb trail to potential competitors. But it's also philosophical. We believe that we want to be believed when we say we've done something and it is completed, that's properly understood. So there's a whole lot of stuff we're working on that we're not going to talk about, but it's going to create the value through 2022, 2023. You look at the intellectual property we filed on controls that's moving into the national phase. That was filed back in 2018. So we're not Johnny-come-latelys to the whole infectious disease industry. We've been thinking about this, planning it, and executing it for a while now. And I think we're just starting to see the recognition of the value that's being created and is being created.
I agree. Well, let's end it there, Cameron. I think we've successfully gone to the 75 minutes that we usually take to do these. Any last thoughts, comments?
Well, I would just want to thank the management team, thank the board, all of the staff that have been working their asses off for 18 months and more to execute during very challenging times. And I'd also like to thank the shareholders that have demonstrated support for Microbix time and again. If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a bigger village to build a successful company. I get to be the mouthpiece here, but I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and there's a big room of really smart people working really hard, and we appreciate everyone's support. So thank you, and that includes you guys.
Cameron, it's always a pleasure working with you and learning about whatever weird thing you guys invent next. So looking forward to that. And thanks everyone for participating and for your questions. If you wanted a more thorough response, please feel free to reach out and I'll do my best. And everyone have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for spending your time with us this afternoon, and continues to be a pleasure and a privilege. Thanks.